We are going to create a wire bead ring as you see here. You're going to need 12 inches of 21 gauge wire, a faceted bead, a ring mandrel, a mandrel holder, multiple pairs of pliers, specifically chain nose pliers, wire cutters, a file, which I don't have here, and a mallet, nylon or rawhide. If you haven't sized your fingers, you're also going to need to do that. Before you start, you're going to need to make sure that you straighten out your wire, get any of the kinks out. You can do this by pinching with one hand and pulling it through the other. Make sure you pivot the wire around. Remember, it's a three-dimensional object. The bends may not all be happening in the same direction. You're just trying to get out the major kinks so that it's nice and smooth. I would suggest starting with a plastic faceted bead. It will be easier and not as slippery to work with. Later, you can choose a glass bead or multiple beads to work with. The facets are going to help hold the wire in place. There are specific things that you need to make sure you do correctly. Attention to detail and craftsmanship tend to make or break jewelry projects. The band shouldn't have any overlapping wires. The wrap coils around the band should be equal and consistent, and the wrap around the bead shouldn't have any overlapping either. Here are a couple of examples of wire bead rings with poor craftsmanship. You can see that the wire wrapping around the band and the bead is done very loosely and inconsistently. With this ring, it is slightly improved, but the student didn't spend any time refining the wire wrapping and left it very loose. The ends of the wires were left sharp and sticking out, making it unwearable. It's going to scratch or catch clothing. This ring is an improvement, but still has some basic flaws. The wrapping around the bead is a little loose and slightly overlapped, but the wrapping around the band is done tightly and evenly on both sides, and the wires on the band are not crisscrossed. This ring is a good example. The wire wrapping is tight, even, and consistent throughout the ring. You can tell there was a good attention to detail. The wire band is overlapped, but overall it has a very clean finish. Especially compared to the first example, this is what attention to detail can do for your project. Both of these rings are made with round glass beads. There are a lot of beautiful glass beads for you to work with in the blue jewelry cabinet, but they are more difficult to work with because they're more slick and will shift around more. Again, you can see what attention to detail and craftsmanship can do. One ring has loose, uneven wrapping. The artist made no attempt to go back and refine or tighten anything. The other ring is consistent and has a very finished quality. You will also have the option to create multi-bead rings. I encourage you to wait to do this until you're more comfortable with the process because the same issues will happen with the overlapping wire. It will be more difficult because there are more variables with the different bead sizes and the beads moving around as you work with the ring. The end result, though, allows for a lot more creativity, and I really do encourage you to push yourself. Lastly, you could incorporate mini beads or some of the irregularly shaped beads to create a very unique ring. You create these by putting the smaller beads along the wire that wraps around the center bead, and then finish it in the exact same way with the coils down the side. To begin the process, you want to make sure that your wire is as straight as possible, and then you're going to thread the bead. You want to make sure that the bead is centered with the two wire ends as equal as possible. If you want, you could pre-mark this out with a Sharpie. Then you want to bend the ends of the wire on either side of the bead so that it doesn't move so much. You're like adding a little crimp. You can do this with your fingers or pliers, whatever you're more comfortable with. You'll want to make sure that the bead on the wire is straight. If the bead is lopsided or angled to one direction, you will not be able to go back and fix this later. Once you have it centered with crimps on either side, you want to make sure you straighten out your wire. It'll make it easier to work with. The goal is that you've crimped the wire slightly to either side of the bead so that it doesn't slide off the center while you're working with it. Next, you'll use the ring mandrel and the mandrel holder. Use your thumb to position the bead at the top. Use your other hand to wrap the wire behind the mandrel so that it goes above the bead, and then the other side of the wire so that it goes below the bead and they're facing in opposite directions. I'm going around the mandrel 2 times so that my band has 2 wires along the back. You're welcome to do a thicker band with more wires along the back, or if you have larger fingers, you're just going to need to ask for more wire. To retain the ring shape, pull on the wire ends to shape them around the mandrel. I suggest doing this along the first portion towards the skinnier section of the mandrel and tightening the wire there. This way, when you move it down to your actual ring size, it won't shift around as much. Your next step, you will firmly pull both wires while you carefully wrap them around the bead. You can do this as many times as you want. I suggest at least 2 or 3 times. Each of the wraps should go below the previous one, so there is no overlapping. Be careful bending and unbending the wire though. It can only go back and forth so many times before it becomes work hardened and breaks. When you work harden something, you are literally crushing the molecules, and there is not an undo for this. See how the wire is not overlapping around the bead? They are neatly stacked with each wrap going below the previous one. If there are gaps in the wraps, you can fix this later. To lock the wrapping in place, we will finish the ring by coiling the wire around the band. You may start this with pliers or your fingers. Be careful to not let your previous wrapping shift while doing this step. I did the beginning of the first wrap for both sides of my ring before tightening anything down. I want to avoid work hardening the ends of my wire and make sure that my wire bands are in the correct spots and not overlapping. Use chain nose pliers to wrap the wire tightly around the band. Use a wrenching, wrist twisting motion to tighten the wire, and it will make it very snug around the band. I do the first wrap on either side tightly before committing to do the rest of the wraps. I want to make sure that my wires and my band are not crisscrossing. You can see how I am gripping and re-gripping the wire in between each twist of the pliers to cinch it tighter and tighter around the band. You want to wrap your band at least 3 times. However many you decide to do though, you want to make sure that both sides match. It should be symmetrical. When you have an even amount of coils on each side, snip off the excess wire and file the ends. If you do not file the wire, the ring will scratch you or catch on clothing and be unwearable. Then use pliers to press the end of the wire against the band. You can even grip around the coil and twist it to tighten it one last time. Clean up your design by using pliers to squeeze the wire wrappings close together so that they are a tight coil. Slide the ring back onto the mandrel and press it down with your fingers to reshape it. If it needs to be larger, you can use a mallet hammered at a 45-degree angle, forcing the ring down the mandrel to a larger size. By using the mallet, you are work hardening the metal, which will help it retain its shape. It also can help stretch the metal to a larger size ring. And there you have it. Now you have a completed wire bead ring.